Iron chains gnaw into her ankles, each small movement scraping bone. Through a slit of a window, she hears the steady thud of a hammer. A carpenter is already building the execution platform in the market square. The fire is still days away. But what happens between accusation and execution will be far worse than the flames themselves. From the 15th to the 18th century, between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe and the American colonies. Most were women. Most were innocent. And every single one was deliberately broken long before the executioner ever lit the pyre. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next exposes the cruelty they never taught in school. The arrest never came quietly. Across Europe, the capture of a suspected witch was staged as public theater. Local officials arrived in broad daylight, often accompanied by priests or ministers ensuring witnesses. This was the first weapon, fear. The walk from home to holding cell became a corridor of hatred. Neighbors who had shared bread with the accused for decades suddenly felt licensed to spit, scream, and throw filth. Accusations flew freely. In minutes, a familiar woman became a monster. In German territories operating under the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina of 1530, judges needed no complaint at all. They could begin prosecutions on their own authority. One man acted as investigator, prosecutor, and judge. There was no neutrality. Roughly 80% of the accused were women, most over 40. Midwives, healers, widows without male protection, women who owned property, women who spoke too sharply. The charges followed the same script: cursing neighbors, consorting with the devil, ruining crops, spreading disease. When disaster struck, someone had to pay, and she was convenient. Before any trial, humiliation came first. Stocks and pillories stood in nearly every town square. Wooden frames designed to immobilize ankles, wrists, or necks. Locked inside, the accused became public property. Crowds were encouraged to participate. Rotten vegetables were mercy. Mud, stones, refuse, and excrement followed. Some women remained trapped for days, denied food and water, forced to soil themselves while laughter echoed around them. The pillory was worse. Bent forward, head and hands forced through wooden holes, muscles screamed under the strain. Mobs sometimes turned violent. Several victims died while restrained, unable to shield themselves. Heavy iron chains bound wrists and ankles. Prisoners were paraded through streets, their slow shuffling drawing larger crowds with every step. The humiliation was calculated. It erased identity. By the time the trials began, the woman standing before the court was already half destroyed. Then came the test. With spirits weakened, authorities turned to so-called divine proof. The swimming test claimed that holy water would reject the ungodly. The logic was lethal. Her clothes were stripped to rags. Her hands bound. A rope was tied around her waist, supposedly for rescue. Then she was thrown into a pond or river. If she sank and drowned, she was innocent. If she floated, she was guilty. Physics was ignored. Air trapped in clothing, natural buoyancy. None of it mattered. Matthew Hopkins used this test relentlessly during his reign of terror from 1644 to 1647. Another ritual was pricking for the devil's mark. Satan was believed to brand his servants with a spot that did not bleed or feel pain. The accused was stripped naked before witnesses. Needles pierced her body again and again. Professional prickers emerged, many frauds using retractable needles that never broke skin. The victim had no defense. Touch tests, scripture recitation, even stumbling over the Lord's Prayer were recorded as proof of guilt. Between arrest and trial, the accused rotted in isolation. Medieval prisons were not correctional facilities, they were human grinders. Cells designed to starve the body and collapse the mind. By the time the fire came, many were already gone. Stone-walled cells, narrow and wet, swallowed the accused in near total darkness. Sanitation did not exist. Human waste pooled on the floor. Rats and insects flourished. Winter cold seeped through the stone, while summer heat turned the cells into suffocating ovens. Food and water arrived irregularly, never enough to nourish, only enough to prevent immediate death. Many prisoners were abandoned entirely, their families too terrified to offer help. Starvation worked patiently, draining strength and clarity. Heavy iron shackles stayed locked throughout imprisonment, often bolted directly to the wall. Sleep itself became a form of torture. The constant weight of iron tore into flesh, leaving open wounds that rotted untreated. Isolation magnified everything. Days and nights dissolved into one endless black void. When isolation failed to break the accused, authorities escalated. Torture followed. Under inquisitorial law, confession was required for conviction. Witchcraft left no physical evidence, so pain became the proof. Legal manuals laid out precise instructions for when and how torture could be used. The Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486, emphasized confession above all else, describing witches as unnaturally silent due to demonic influence. Torture was framed as a necessary act to force truth from bodies supposedly protected by Satan himself. Sleep deprivation was the most common method. It left no marks and destroyed resistance quickly. The accused was kept awake for days through relentless questioning, constant prodding, or being forced to walk in circles until collapse. Interrogators worked in shifts so rest never came. After enough sleeplessness, the mind fractured. Hallucinations appeared. Simple questions became impossible to understand. Reality dissolved. Resistance vanished. Many confessed to anything just to be allowed a few minutes of sleep, fully aware that confession meant death, but finding death preferable to continued torment. The strappado followed. Hands were bound behind the back. The victim was hoisted into the air by the wrists. Shoulders dislocated almost instantly. Pain exploded through the body and never faded. Sometimes weights were attached to the legs, increasing the strain. Victims were raised and dropped repeatedly. Each fall tore damaged joints further apart. Each suspension stretched suffering longer. The rack was the most infamous device. Victims were tied to a wooden frame by wrists and ankles. Rollers pulled the body in opposite directions. Pain began as crushing pressure, then crossed into something beyond comprehension as joints separated. The executioner controlled the pace, stretching slowly or violently jerking the body apart. Anne Askew, condemned for heresy in 1546, endured the rack until she could no longer stand and had to be carried to her execution. Thumbscrews were simpler and devastating. Fingers were placed between metal plates and slowly compressed. Victims remained conscious while agony intensified with each turn. The pressure increased gradually, allowing answers between waves of pain. Few resisted long. Confession was never enough. Authorities demanded names. Other witches. Sabbaths attended. Pacts signed with Satan. Desperate to end their suffering, victims accused neighbors, friends, even family. Witch hunts spread like fire. In Bamberg, Germany, between 1626 and 1631, nearly 900 people were burned after torture produced ever-growing lists of conspirators. Each confession created new arrests. Each arrest led to new torture. The cycle fed itself. After weeks or months of torment, the accused finally faced execution. Even death was theater. Burning at the stake was reserved for witches and heretics across continental Europe. The punishment carried religious symbolism. A burned body could not rise on Judgment Day, condemning the victim to eternal annihilation. Fire was said to purify, erasing corruption completely. Some who confessed were granted the mercy of strangulation before the flames. Others burned alive, fully conscious. The execution platform stood in the town square, placed where no one could look away. Construction began days before the execution. The rhythmic hammering echoed through the streets, a deliberate reminder to those imprisoned of what was coming. By the morning of the burning, crowds gathered hours in advance, fighting for the best vantage points. What followed was not chaos but choreography, a carefully staged spectacle meant to reinforce obedience through terror. The condemned was led to the stake in a formal procession, transforming their final walk into ritual humiliation. Some were dressed in special garments. Others were marked with symbols of their alleged crimes. Many were forced to wear placards listing their offenses for the crowd to read. Reactions varied. Some jeered, shouting curses and throwing debris. Others watched in silence, unsettled by how easily an accusation could place anyone in that position. All were tied to the wooden post, ropes pulled tight to prevent movement, escape, or resistance. Methods of burning differed by region, each engineered with its own cruelty. In some areas, wood was stacked only around the victim's feet, allowing the flames to climb slowly upward. Death could take an agonizingly long time. The victim often remained conscious, screaming as fire consumed flesh inch by inch. The crowd heard everything. The spectacle was the message. In other regions, particularly parts of Germany and France, Wood was piled high around the entire body. This concealed the victim from view while intensifying the heat. Death came faster, but the suffering was hidden, denying spectators the full horror while ensuring the outcome. A third method involved tying the condemned to a ladder and swinging it directly into existing flames, combining sudden immersion with prolonged burning. The agony defied language. Sometimes smoke inhalation killed the victim before the flames reached them, a rare mercy. More often, consciousness remained as fire engulfed the body. Screams filled the square, ricocheting off stone walls, sounds witnesses carried for the rest of their lives. Joan of Arc, burned in 1431 in Rouen, reportedly died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached her, though this small mercy came only after months of imprisonment and a politically driven trial. Not all regions burned witches. In England and the American colonies, hanging was the preferred method. Legal tradition classified witchcraft as a felony, punishable by the noose. During the Salem witch trials of 1692, 19 people were hanged on Gallows Hill, their bodies left suspended as warnings. One man, Giles Corey, suffered a different fate. Refusing to enter a plea, he was crushed under heavy stones, a punishment meant to force cooperation. He endured in silence until death. Bodies were often denied dignity after execution. Ashes were scattered or buried in unmarked graves. Corpses were left on display. Proper burial was refused. The true horror of the witch trials was not only the executions, but their systematic nature. Communities turned neighbors into monsters through procedures that exposed humanity at its darkest. Fear, superstition, and resentment fused into machinery that destroyed tens of thousands of lives. Every step was documented, proved, legalized. Authorities believed they were enforcing justice. These women and men were not witches. They were victims, sacrificed to fear, scapegoating, and legal systems that demanded confessions instead of truth. When you consider what the accused endured before ever reaching the flames, the question becomes unavoidable. Which was more terrifying, the fire itself or the certainty with which ordinary people convinced themselves they were righteous while destroying their own neighbors? The fires have long gone cold. The machinery that built them has not.